If somebody's listening to this and they're watching this and they're struggling right now with some head trash, some negative thinking, what do you think is the most like effective way to deal with it?
Learn about the tools that exist for managing your emotions. No one size fits all solution. So it's kind of like going to the gym. If you want to get fit, you've got to learn the different exercises to achieve that goal. Same is true when it comes to getting fit with your mind. You got to learn about what the tools are, and then you've got to start self experimenting, find the tools that work best for you. I'm pretty sure, Doug, we haven't talked about this yet privately, but if I was to survey the three or four or seven or eight tools that you use to right your mind when you need to, it's likely going to be different from what I benefit from in some ways. And as a scientist who studies emotion, that makes complete sense. You know why? Because your emotional life is utterly distinctive, right? Our emotional lives are like fingerprints, quite unique. So, why wouldn't regulating them and the tools we use to regulate them also be distinctive?
I know one of the tools you talk about, or one of the things that you talk about that can help people really calm themselves down, is to understand that negative emotions are useful and they're not bad. Talk about that.
Yeah, so many of us, because of the culture surrounding us, the culture we kind of live and breathe, we often think that the goal in life should be just to not experience any negative emotions, right? Like just positive all the time. Like, let me be clear, I'm a big fan of positivity, Doug. Like, I like feeling positive, but I also know that if my goal is to always be positive, to never experience negative emotions like anxiety or anger or sadness, number one, that's an impossible goal, not possible to achieve that end because we evolved to have these emotions for a reason, which gets us to the second thing I think about when I hear about this goal to always be positive, which is I don't want to give up my capacity to experience negative emotions because when I have them in the right proportions, they actually help me. Anxiety, as long as it doesn't get too big or last too long, it actually helps me. It tunes me into things that matter, tells me to prepare. Anger can motivate me to correct an injustice. Like, I'm not giving up those negative emotional responses, but I am committing myself deeply to learning how to harness them.
And how can somebody harness that inner voice before it does get to some severe type of anxiety or panic or fear?
Well, there are lots of things you can do. I think step one, recognize that you can, in fact, control your emotions. Not everyone believes that. And there's this one study I quote in my book about 40% of, and this study was adolescents, said when asked, can you control your emotions? No, you can't. There are facets of our emotional lives that we can't control. So we can't always control the thoughts that pop into our head and lead us to feel a certain way. Right before we started recording, we were both talking about thoughts that sometimes pop into our head we're not very proud of, serve a function probably, right? Dark thoughts sometimes, right? We don't always have control over those automatic reactions. Like you may bump into someone on the street and they're pretty smelly. You're going to experience a negative emotional response automatically. Can't control that, but what you can control is what happens once that negative emotional response is triggered. That's when all the different tools I talk about in my book come into play. What can you do? You could do a lot of different things. You could harness your senses. Senses are a really powerful tool for pushing our emotions around. Sight, sound, touch, smell, hearing. Music, as an example, is one of my favorite tools for quickly rerouting my emotional experience. Right? Like if I'm not feeling great about something, anxious or sad, I pop on some of my favorite like pump up songs or feel good songs. Instantly pushes me in a different direction. Attention can be really powerful. Like we often hear that we should always approach our problems, never look away. Sometimes looking away for a little while can actually be helpful. I get into an argument with someone or I get really anxious about something, taking some time away from it and then coming back to it later. Sometimes I find that problem actually what this is not a problem. Like with the distance, with the time away from it, I realize this is small beans. In other cases, I realize, all right, I can look at the bigger picture now, not have it get me down. Those are two amidst many other things that people can do. Do you ever use either of those tools?
Of course. And you mentioned distance, and I wanted to throw in like the one that comes to mind. You were asking me like how I manage certain things, and you actually talked about it before we recorded, and that is what would you tell your best friend in the situation? It's like really creating distance and separation. And you've heard a lot about this. You see this in the self-help space. Like, if your best friend were talking to you, if you're talking to your best friend like that, how would they feel? And, so why does that reframe work so well?
Well, it works real well because of something called Solomon's paradox, which is this finding which captures a fundamental truism of the human condition. We're much better at giving advice to other people than we are giving advice to ourselves. When we focus on our own problems, we have biases that often come into play. We get flustered with emotion in ways that zoom us in, help us prevent us from looking at the bigger picture. When you're talking to someone else, it's easier to look at the situation objectively. And that often leads to better, wiser solutions to our problems. And so the real challenge, of course, here is like, how do you actually focus on yourself from a distance perspective? How do you actually relate to yourself like you're giving advice to a friend? And one tool that we find useful there is to silently use your name and you to coach yourself through a problem. All right, Ethan, how are you going to manage this situation? And the reason we find that this is useful is if you think about the word you, that's a word you typically use when you're thinking about or referring to another person. So when you use it to refer to yourself, it's automatically switching your perspective. It's putting you into this advice giving mode. You want to do that silently, of course, not out loud, because we're not used to people talking to themselves out loud. It violates social norms. But that's one way of getting distance. The other set of distancing tools that I personally am very fond of is something that we call mental time travel. So, in contrast to what you often hear, which is the thing to do when you're upset is just focus on the now, be in the moment. That can be useful for lots of people, but let's not forget we evolve the ability to travel in time in our minds for a reason, and you can use it to your benefit. So, you could go forward in time. How am I going to feel about this next week, next month, or next year? When you do that, what you realize is most of our experiences as time goes on, they fade with intensity, right? So that takes the edge off. Or you go back in time. I start my book with a story of my grandparents fleeing the Nazis during World War II. The Nazis were trying to kill them. When things seem really tough for me, I get into my time machine, go back to 1943, hang out with my grandparents in the bunkers in the woods of Eastern Poland in the winter. Don't have to spend a lot of time with them, just a little bit. And boy, does that give me some distance, some objectivity, like, wow, what I'm dealing with could be so much worse. And so those are a few other tools, distancing tools.
I want to get into like positive thinking. And you talked about people need to learn to accept their emotions. One of the things I've said over the years is that, you don't have to be positive all the time, but when you are going through something negative, I think you have to have some level of optimism about your ability to get through it. Do you believe there's truth in that?
Wholeheartedly, I would use the phrase self-efficacy, which I talk about in the book. Self-efficacy is the belief that you are capable of achieving some end. You can do this. And I talk about it as a kind of master belief because when I think about managing your emotions, emotion regulation, self control, all phrases mean the same thing. At the 30,000 foot level, like what does it take to manage your emotions? Two things. Number one, you need some motivation, right? You need to be motivated to recognize, hey, this is something I can actually do. I want to do it. If you don't think you can do something, then you're not going to do it, right? If I don't think it's possible to lose weight and get my muscles bigger, why would I go to the gym and even try? So step one is like, yeah, like I think I can actually manage my emotions, that positive orientation. And that alone though is also not enough, right? Because once you're motivated, let's say to use the metaphor of I'm motivated to lose weight, and get stronger, I still now need to know how to use the different pieces of equipment in the gym, right? How to fold that into my life. And so that's why you need the motivation, this positive belief that you're talking about. And then you need the tools. And you have both of those things. That's a secret.
Do you know if there's any research on how long it takes for somebody to reframe the way they talk to themselves and the way they handle their inner voice? Like, just let's just say somebody has had like negative self talk for like 10 years. I mean, is there a way for them to like change the way they talk to themselves in like a month or two?
That's a great question. Here's what I know, and here's what I don't know. What I know is that you can see shifts in how people talk to themselves happening in the lab that have what we call acute effects. So immediate, very quickly after you direct people to talk to themselves in a particular way, you get them moving in a different direction in terms of their emotional trajectory. In terms of the enduring effects of that, like how long does it take to make that a habit that kicks in and when does it wear off, that we know a lot less about. A general principle here, though, is the more you do something, the more habitual it becomes, the more likely you are to do it when it matters. And so, one of the actually the last chapter of my book, it's called "From Knowing to Doing," and it addresses this question of, there's so many books out there, so many talks and workshops, and there are all these tools we're given to people. But I think the experience that so many people have, and I've had this experience, is you hear about this stuff, you say to yourself, "Oh yes, I'm gonna do it. It's gonna like improve X, Y, and Z," and then you forget 98% of what you heard, and you go back to life as you were living it before the talk or the presentation or the book. And so scientists have actually been trying to understand, how do you get people better at taking the things they learn and putting that knowledge into action in their lives. And interestingly enough, the framework that they've discovered, they've figured out how to help people, is quite similar to what the Navy SEALs do when they're trying to be successful on deployments. So when the Navy SEALs are going into a mission, before they go into a mission, they do the following. They identify what their goal is. Like, what's the outcome I hope to? What's the goal I'm trying to accomplish here? Right? Like, get the bad guy. What's the outcome that will occur if you are successful? The world will be safer. Lots of people will be free. And the purpose there is you're thinking about, like, well, what are all the good things that might come if I achieve this goal? Then you think about the obstacles. All right, what might get in the way for me achieving this goal? And you list them out. So now you're thinking about the potential road mines. And then you come to planning, but you have a specific plan. Like, if this thing happens, then I'm going to do this. If this happens, then I'm going to do that. So you rehearse those specific plans and you go over that. And so the Navy SEALs, they'll go around Socratic style in a room. Like, they'll call on one another. Hey, what happens if this happens? What happens if that? So it turns out we can do that for ourselves. It's called Whoop. That's a little device to remember it. WOOP. If you've got a really important goal, you want to talk better to yourself to be healthier. You want to get less upset at your kids or your partner. You want to stay calm when you're triggered with things that make you anxious. The W, what's your wish? What's that goal you hope to achieve? The first O, that's your outcome. What good will come if you achieve this goal? The second O, that's the obstacle. What are the personal obstacles that might get in the way? And then you get to your P, those if then plans. And so that's how you can get a lot better at this stuff.
I love that, man. I'm interested to know your thoughts on where our emotions and thoughts come from. Like, you hear a lot about people who are quote unquote energy vampires or Debbie Downer and terms like that. Like, do you think people that are just super negative have a negative frame of mind? Is it because of genetics? Is it because of choices they've made? Is it because of their environment, their life? Like, what do you find to be the common through line with that?
Well, most things when it comes to our psychological lives and complex experiences like emotion, have some genetic influence. They also have an environmental, a learned experience. So, and we also increasingly know that our our lived experiences, our environment can actually influence the way our genes are expressed. I think you have both sources. The most important finding that I cling to when people ask me questions like this is the fact that this is malleable. We know this is malleable. Your capacity to become super reactive or underreactive or to manage your emotions, it can be pushed around. And like, on the one hand, we evolve this capacity to experience all these different emotions. And yes, our genetics may tune us to certain kinds of experiences more than others and lead us to be more or less reactive. But we also co evolved this capacity to rein in those emotions or amplify them. But that capacity to push our emotions around, like, It's a really powerful set of tools, but it doesn't come with a user's guide. And that's what the science and what this book was intended to do, is to provide people with a kind of user's guide for managing their emotional lives.
One of the things that comes up for people when it comes to their emotional health is dealing with fear. And a lot of times, the fear of the actual outcome is bigger than the fear in itself. How can people get better at future tripping and dealing with fear?
Well, fear is something that, if it's a specific thing that people fear, first of all, and this is a mantra of the book, there are different ways to intervene, different strokes for different folks. One kind of intervention for managing fear is something called prolonged exposure, which does involve confronting the fear, learning that it has less of an effect overview than you think. And once you have that experience, it neutralizes the fear. So the idea here is, look, like, let's say, I actually talk about this in the book. Let's say I'm absolutely phobic about snakes. Like, it's hard for me to articulate why. Just the mere even thinking about it makes me really, really just sweats, anxious, all this stuff. What you might do it with in a prolonged exposure intervention, and this is often clinically delivered with a therapist. First you might imagine what a snake looks like, and then you might look at a picture of it, and then you gradually confront the feared object, and at the very end you kind of drape the snake over you. And what happens is you learn that doing these things doesn't lead to the outcomes you feared. Your brain is constantly keeping track of those experiences, right? And it's often updating our, what we call, our mental representations of these things. So if I learn that speaking in front of other people, I'm not going to get fired, get asked questions that make me cry, like, the more I do it and I have that experience, the more confident I'm getting about that. And so there are lots of things you could do to help with fear. That's just one.
I love the exposure therapy reference. I don't know if you're familiar with Dan Harris.
I am.
Yeah, he came on the show and he talked about how exposure therapy has really helped him a lot with his anxiety and fears and stuff.
Exposure therapy works for a lot of people. It is very useful. Some people find it challenging because you are really getting people to face your fears. And there are other techniques that you can use if it doesn't work for you. And so, I think, just, zooming out a second, Doug, I think that's a message that I hope people find really liberating, because what I have found over the course of my career is that new tools, science-based tools even, come on the scene or get promoted and talked about a lot. Mindfulness would be a great example, and meditation. Like, 25 years ago, this was very fringy. People weren't doing it. Then all of a sudden it became extremely mainstream. Not everyone benefits from mindfulness and meditation. Lots of people do, and there's great science behind it. But I have encountered several people who've said, like, yeah, I tried it a lot and it just doesn't help me. And they begin to wonder, is there something wrong with them, right? Because they hear all this good stuff about it. Different tools for different people should liberate folks from having that experience. Like, my advice to people is, try a tool, give it a shot, like, really give it a shot. But if it doesn't work for you, don't keep doing it. Like, there's certain forms of athletic intervention, certain sports like basketball as an example, like, not for me. It's just like, it doesn't work. But I can, have fun playing sports, like do other things, wrestling, and in my past, cycling, soccer, so we got to find our sweet spot there.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about meditation and mindfulness. It's something that I've tried to get better at over the years. I have a hard time sitting still at times, and I'll go to meditate and then I'll be like, maybe this isn't for me. And then I like justify and rationalize it. But then I'm like, wait a second, like this is part of the problem. Like you can't sit still. So you need to like find something to help you get through that. So I totally relate to the fact that there's certain things that there's a lot of evidence behind it that don't work necessarily for everyone. Speaking of reframes and sports, I heard you on another podcast tell a story about intrusive thoughts. And, we all, I think, at times have these, and they carry a lot of shame. either because it's the way that we talk to ourselves or it's the thoughts that we have. I would love for you to tell the story about you at the gym and then how people can reframe some of these, horrible thoughts we have at times.
Yeah, so I like to this goes back to like the parts of our emotional experiences that we have control over and the parts that we don't. Like I've often had this experience at the gym where I'll be carrying a dumbbell from one side of the gym to the other, and there'll be someone like lying on a yoga mat, not directly in my path, but like close to it. And I'll have this vivid thought about dropping the dumbbell like on the person's face. It's a terrible, terrible thought, right? And the moment I have the thought, I push the dumbbell in my other hand, right, further away from them, and I squeeze it tight. I don't have control over when that thought is going to be triggered. Circumstances often do it. And, on the one hand, it seems like a pretty dark thought. It's probably my mind's way of simulating a worst case scenario to prevent it from happening, right? Like it would be a pretty bad thing if I dropped the ginormous dumbbells that I use in the gym on that person's face, joking. That would not be good though, right? So my mind's probably simulating that to warn me, okay, take precaution here. It's like when my kids were little, I would have thoughts sometimes of them jumping off docks, if we were in a like a kind of beach place or falling in other ways. This is now serving a function in terms of it's heightening my radar, my alarm system for bad stuff, so I attend to it. Regardless, because I know that I don't have control over those thoughts and feelings, I don't get down on myself for it. I experience it and then I regulate it. And that serves me really well, right? Because these thoughts, you tell me, Doug, do you experience thoughts like that fairly often or on occasion?
Of course, over the course of my life, I've definitely had thoughts where I'm like, wow, I can't believe that I thought that. And then, of course, there's a lot of shame that goes around it. It's like, why would you think that? Are you a bad person? But like listening to you kind of reframe that and being like, well, the reason you're thinking that is because you're worried about like the worst possible scenario of you doing that. And then you're in a way protecting yourself. And it's just totally resonated with me. So it's like, totally makes sense. Our body is wired for survival and protection, right? And that is, I guess, just one of its ways of helping.
Yeah, and so here's the way I use this information for me. Like if I find that a dark thought pops up every now and again, I recognize that this is the way my brain is operating. And this experience, by the way, is close to a universal experience. There's been a lot of research on this cross culturally. Like when I teach, I will often ask my students or workshop participants, have you ever had like, have you experienced a thought within the past week or two that you were ashamed of, you wouldn't want to admit out loud? Everyone has an example of this. So I don't beat myself up for having those thoughts. What I would get upset about is if I acted on those thoughts. Because while I don't have control over the thoughts that pop into my head, what I do have control, what we all have control over, is our ability to manage the trajectory of that emotional response that occurs after those thoughts are triggered. So I'm not acting on, I'm not doing any of those harmful things. And I think that's an important distinction to keep in mind.
As somebody like yourself that studies the mind, I'm curious about something. I heard you talk about like the benefits of music, right? And I also heard you in another episode talk about like many people know how music makes them feel, but a very small percentage actually uses it when they're like going through a tough time. Like, why do you think that people, even though they know what will help them, they just do the complete opposite during hard times?
With yeah, this is an interesting phenomenon when it comes to music. So let me back up a second. So first of all, you did your homework here. You've listened to some other interviews. Music is an interesting tool because it's a what I call sensory shifter. It's using our senses to shift us. And like if you ask people, why do you listen to music? Almost everyone will say, because I like the way it makes me feel, right? It's an emotional experience listening to music. But as you noted, only 10 to 30% in the research that we've done of folks report using music as a tool when they're really struggling. In fact, People often listen to music to sink them deeper into their negative state. So a lot of people often have the experience of when they're sad, they don't put on the Journey or AC/DC or whatever it is that pumps you up, Taylor Swift. They go in the opposite direction, right? They listen to music like that makes them sink deeper into that state. This is called the emotional congruency effect. It's a very common experience. Here's the deal with this. I'm a proponent of the belief that all emotions are useful in the right proportions, even emotions like sadness. We experience sadness when we register some loss that we can't replace. And when that happens, sadness motivates us to now turn inward. Let's make sense of what happened. Like, how am I going to deal with this situation given I've got to deal with it? How am I going to make new meaning out of life here? Sadness motivates us to do that. If that's working for you and you want to stay in that sad state to continue making meaning that is productive, then by all means, turn on Chicago or whatever the sad song is that's going to help you maintain that state. But if your goal is to get out of that state, then you should do the opposite. Then you should reach for the pump up music. And so the hope here is that just starting a conversation about these tools and how they work should allow people to shift from being relatively automatic in how they use these things, maybe just sliding into singing, hearing a certain song or diverting your attention a particular way, to being much more strategic about this stuff. When I go to the gym to work out, I'm not just like meandering through. Oh, that looks interesting. Let me try that. Oh, what about that machine? That looks fun. Right? Like I have specific things I do. It's timed and it's super efficient. That's the goal when it comes to managing our emotions.
Well, I think the problem with this stuff is that you mentioned music and you mentioned a lot of these tools is that when people are needing to use these tools, it's normally during times where they're feeling discouraged. It's not like when they're at the top. It's not like when they've just, gotten a nice bonus. It's normally like, man, I've had like a string of bad days, or I just went through a horrific breakup. Is there certain tools you recommend, whether it's journaling or something like affirmations, to help somebody feel more positive, like in the moment when they're feeling discouraged?
Well, I think remembering, thinking about like past successes can be helpful. Thinking about times when they've overcome adversity and other people in their lives that they know or people in their part of our culture has done this, like this is what I do with the grandmother stuff with mental time travel, right? That's like, well, she was able to get through that, maybe I can too. This is also where I think, what would you say to a friend? Ethan, you got this, man. Can be really, really helpful, right? Like, I never, when my friends come to me for advice when they're down and struggling, Doug, I have never once said to them, yeah, you suck. You're not going to do this. You're going to, like, spiral into doom and despair and life will be over. I never say that, right? I give them the more constructive talk. So, I think you could do a few things, a bunch of things to do that to help yourself. And I think you can listen to music too. You don't have to restrict yourself from activating that channel as well.
So it's one thing to manage our own emotions. We've talked a lot about that. I think the other layer of this is how can we help other people with their emotions? What are some ways that people can get better at helping other people effectively manage their emotions?
Well, step one is learn these tools, right? Because you learn about these tools, it's going to help you. But what it then empowers you to do is you can then activate these tools in other people when other people are struggling or come to you for help. So let me give you a couple examples. Because I know how these sensory shifters work and the power of music or affectionate touch. If my daughters have a bad day, they're struggling with stuff, they're stressed about school and boys, I can activate these shifters without them even knowing it, right? I put music on in the house, feel good music. I come over to them, I give them an affectionate embrace, right? Like I'm using my usage of these tools not to help me, to help them. I'm using my knowledge of how attention works sometimes to distract them, right? Not to get them to like chronically avoid problems, but sometimes, hey, let's take a break. Let's do some other fun stuff, right? I'm not telling them to distract, I'm doing it for them. perspective shifting, because I know how perspective shifting works. One of my, my daughter maybe be like really worrying about something, like, well, let's think of the big picture here, sweetie. Like, how do you think this compares to like this problem you experienced before, or something that your grandparents experienced or your great grandparents, right? So if you know how these tools work, you can be the agent that activates them for other people.
One of the things I was actually surprised about when learning about emotions years ago, I think it was when I was prepping for interviewing Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but
I am.
she was talking about, I think it was facial expressions and how different facial expression people have different facial expressions for different emotions. I would love to hear your thoughts on, like, do you think that facial expressions are an accurate way to assess somebody's emotions?
Sometimes I think of emotions as activating a loosely coordinated set of responses within a person. So when you experience an emotion, there are typically things happening in your body. Your thoughts are being organized in a particular way. So if it's anxiety, you're zooming in on the thing that's you're worried about. There's often a facial signature of those emotional states. I say often, not always, because it's malleable, right? Like I can be wanting to laugh at a funeral, but you would never know. I can be seething and totally upset, but smiling, because I have control over my facial displays. And there are learned responses that can impact the way we express our emotions too. So I think you often do get insight into people's emotional states from their face, but it's not a perfect signal by any means.
Yeah, because I remember I was reading, like, the same expression one person may have for, anger might be excitement for somebody else, and you just never know. But I do think, like, if you're in a room with somebody and you've known somebody well enough, you can tell when someone's pissed.
Yeah, and you could tell the context. Yeah, I think there's no question that the face often provides useful information about emotion. The danger is becoming over reliant on the face. It is one source of information, and it is fallible. It is not a direct readout of what someone's feeling all the time.
When it comes to, like, decision making, like, how do you think somebody can efficiently, like, talk to themselves through something to make the right move?
The best way to optimize decision making when it comes to self talk, which you're asking about, is number one, you want to cut the rumination and chatter out of the equation, because what that does is number one, it consumes our attentional resources, because all the attention is devoted to the chatter, and so that doesn't allow us to use our minds fully to make good decisions. So that's not good. Number two, if it's, chatter can often, especially if it's of the anxiety form, lead us to become more risk averse. And so it can lead us to do things that may not be in our best interest because we're overly sensitive to threats, right? And so, like, there may be an adaptiveness to that to some extent, but there may be some hazards as well. So, like, have you ever like regretted making a decision when you were worried or ruminating about something, like it led you to take a course of action that wasn't actually optimal because it made you overly anxious?
Of course, and it goes back to that old saying, it's like never make, like, long-term decisions based on a short-term emotion. Yeah, I've definitely done that, where I've done something in the moment when I'm like, I look back an hour later, a day later, and I was like, "Oh, why did I do or say that?"
Yeah. So you got to be really, I mean, I think being aware of this first and foremost is important, because it's natural. It's natural for people to become more risk averse when they're struggling with something that they're really worried about. It doesn't mean you need to like make the decision in that moment, but as you're saying, just sometimes even pausing and committing to not making a decision now. Let me make it later today or tomorrow when I'm in a different frame of mind. I think that's a very wise course of action.
What is, like, the number one thing you want people to take away from your latest book?
All emotions are useful when they're in the right proportions, right? Even the bad ones, they serve a function. And when they are not in the right proportions, you have tools to manage them. We all do. There's no one size fits all solutions. And that should be a really, really comforting message. There are lots of things you could do to manage your emotions. The key is to learn about the tools, figure out the ones that work best for you, and then start helping up other people do the same.
It's interesting you bring that up, and talking about they're all good in the right proportion. Negative emotions often obviously get a bad rap, and we spent time talking about that. What about positive emotions? Like, do you think sometimes people need to do a better job at like harnessing their positive emotions?
I do. I mean, excessive laughter has gotten me into trouble on a number of occasions earlier in my life, laughing in the wrong context. I know some people that are so, in general, optimism is linked with good outcomes, but it is also the case that optimism, if you don't allow negative experiences like to guide your attention, hey, I screwed up, maybe I need to fix this. If you're just chronically reframing it positively, like you're not learning from the bad stuff, you're not improving. So in general, I think it is healthy to be in a more positive state in general, but we need to recognize that there are times to regulate our positive emotions as well.
When it comes to like mental resiliency, I know we've touched on it, but you know, I think for me, one of the biggest benefits of going through a lot of adversity early in my life is that when I go through adversity now, I don't spiral because I've just conditioned myself to know that like it's not going to be easy. I may come out of this with a few bumps and bruises, but I at least know I'm going to be okay and I'll get through this. Do you think the best way to build mental resiliency is to just go through challenging times in life?
Well, it doesn't always build resiliency. It can, and I think it goes back to if you get through something and you survive, it's like a fork in the road. On the one hand, you can learn from that and get stronger. On the other hand, you could keep on replaying it and being, oh my God, what if this happened and would it happen again? So this is really where the opportunity lies. So you've been really fortunate that you've been able to go down the adaptive route where you've gotten stronger from your adversity. Not everyone does, but everyone has the opportunity to. And I think part of the reason why people don't is because the negative emotions associated with that adversity get in the way. And this is another reason why understanding how to manage those emotions is so unbelievably important. I mean, like Doug, I've had, many like hiccups in my life too, sometimes more, right? And if I just rehash those moments, like that's it. I'm not getting better, right? I'm just going in the wrong direction. I'm stagnating or getting stuck. And that's not what we want. That's where the need to regulate emotions is so important.
I'm curious, like, what is some of the common head trash that lives between your ears?
What's my common head trash? I can think about screw ups and be like, God damn it. I have a little inner critic there. Pretty good in general with not getting the inner critic activated, but it happens. I got to catch myself and then regulate when it does. When it comes to like, well, kids, family, health stuff, like making sure everyone's okay, that is a concern as well. So that could be there's some head trash there as well.
Anything else that you'd like to add to this conversation that you think would be beneficial when it comes to harnessing the inner voice, reframing negative thoughts, reducing and getting rid of things like fear and anxiety?
I think we've covered quite a bit. I guess the last thing I would just say is culture matters too, and culture's like the air we breathe. We're in it all the time, and we all play a role in shaping our cultures. Like, what do I mean by that? Culture is like what we value and what we believe. Do you think it's possible to manage your emotions? Do you think it's important to do so? Culture is also about giving people tools in that culture for following through with their beliefs, like the tools I talk about in Shift. And so I think just being mindful of that too is useful. That like we all, once you understand how this works, like you're in a position now to change the culture. I think it's important that we do that because if you look at the statistics on how we're faring when it comes to our emotional lives, it ain't good. So we could do a lot better.
Well, Ethan, this has been amazing. Appreciate you coming back on the podcast. Love your work. I think people are going to get a lot of value out of this conversation. If they want to grab the book and learn more about your research, where can they do that?
They could go to my website, ethankross.com, find out about both of my books, my research, all that good stuff.
Amazing. Thanks again, man.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.